Can you get something to happen from like humble pieces of gear?
This channel is supported by Truefire. Truefire is an online library
enough, you can get the Truefire All Access Pass for as cheap as they ever do it, the $99 thing. So just jump and do that if you're looking for the best price that you can get Truefire All Access for. Over the years, I've definitely spent in the region of about £100,000 on gear. The reason I know it's this high is because about 2-3 years ago, I actually started selling off a bunch of gear with a spreadsheet, and the figures were surprisingly high. And since then, you know, like at the start of the year, I did a bunch of videos with Fender Strats and spent some bonkers amount of money in the first, well, like in a space of a few months, and the Nacho and the Danocaster. So for sure, I'm someone that, obviously this is a job to some extent, but I'm definitely someone who's well aware that, you know, sometimes we spend a lot of money on this stuff. So when people say the gear doesn't matter, to some extent, I kind of think, like, what are you talking about? Like, and oftentimes people will be playing, you know, like a vintage Strat or a vintage telly, and they'll be telling you, like, the gear doesn't matter. So my instant feeling with it is like, well, yeah, because you have all the gear. And, you know, if I sit here and tell you the gear doesn't matter from, you know, my bedroom, but regardless, I've got some really nice guitars, I've got some nice amps, and some of you guys at home might not have any of that stuff. But I kind of thought, you know, I was scrolling through Instagram, I saw a video that Bruce Springsteen had recorded the album Nebraska with two of these guys, and the album that he had done before that was recorded in a studio with loads and loads of expensive gear. And I even saw an interview talking about something to do with, like, they'd gone into another studio that only had some silly expensive Neumann mic, a couple of SM57s, and the Neumann U67, and they were surprised because they'd been used to going into like £1 million studios. This was Springsteen related as well, and I just thought, actually, there is something to this, right? Where if you've got something to say, then maybe the gear doesn't matter as much. other kind of thing with this is it's really sold me on the idea that maybe everyone should have a Shure SM57 because it's a really useful mic. I bought two mics at the same time. I bought this one, the SM57. I bought a Roya R121. Now the Roya costs like 15 times the amount of this. I've used it way less, and I think that is really somewhat the lesson here. It's not necessarily about buying tons of gear, but it is about having the right gear that is going to get you the desired result. And sometimes I think it's best to think about certain types of gear. So like if you're someone who's into, I don't know, so for instance, picking a guitar. So how do you know which Strat to buy? If you see like Rhett Schuller's done a bunch of these shootouts and stuff like that, from classic vibe up to like custom shop, when you hear those things in a shootout, like the type of guitar is what you end up hearing. And to be honest, if you pick any of those Strats, depending on the part and whether that guitar can be played, they all sound basically within a realm of like, yep, that fits actually. And I think that is true of kind of quite a lot of gear. So the real thing that I've kind of learned is that the diminishing returns aspect is definitely real. And to the point where, you know, for instance, I could pick an artist telly-up, you know, relatively inexpensive, like 300 quid if you can get them. And then I could pick up a Natrocaster, and the results are going to be pretty similar. At this point, once you spend sort of 200, 300, 400 pounds on a guitar, you're getting to a level of quality these days which is pretty much on par with quite a lot of the more expensive mass-produced stuff. It's kind of just, you'd expect this to more or less be the case when stuff is mostly being built by a CNC and then finished by hand, that it wouldn't actually take tons to close that gap to a point where the guitar plays pretty well, intonates well, and when you put it through the same signal chain, ends up sounding pretty good. Now, there is, though, something else to this, which is, if you read a little deeper, well, not even that much deeper, just go into the Wikipedia on the Nebraska album, and there's like this romantic idea around it that, you know, you could just with two SM57s and a tape machine, and I think an Echoplex, and a few instruments, you could record, you know, an album that could be heard by millions and that sort of stuff. Now, that is the case if you're Bruce Springsteen, or Bon Iver, you know, has done similar sorts of things. There's a few artists that, a lot of artists that have already obviously been inspired by this approach. And, but there were problems with Nebraska, essentially, right? And that is the reason that it's a lo-fi album. And when they went to master it, they had a few attempts with a few different people at mastering this album, but found like there was too much noise to get a good mix onto vinyl, apparently. So that is kind of the part of the story that you sort of miss, right, when you romanticize it and say, well, that we use Shure SM57s and just a tape recorder and record it in the room. But there is also this other side to it, that actually like having the most clean, most pristine recording with zero noise, again, is not actually as important. Something raw, something real is also pretty inspiring, or can be, if you're Bruce Springsteen. So that was another side of it where I thought, actually, there's something to that. Like, if you recorded that album in a studio, you know, an expensive studio. This was a whole reason, by the way, that Bruce Springsteen did this thing. Apparently, like, he'd recorded and was writing in the studio, which was super expensive. And the whole idea of Nebraska was to do a more stripped back approach. And so he was writing at home in his bedroom. Basically, Nebraska might be considered one of the more important bedroom recordings, which I think is actually now what a lot of us can think of ourselves as. You know, we're not, I'm certainly not considering what I do art or anything like that, because I think, well, it's like a big word to use, but it is somewhat similar to these sorts of processes where you're sitting down, you're trying to be creative, and you're trying to create a little bit of a moment. It's not necessarily that different to that approach. So I think maybe the idea, forget some of the gear for a while and just think like, well, what would I do if I only had like this stuff? Whatever you've already got, like, this is the real point for me, is that you probably don't need anything else beyond what you've already got. Like, probably that Strat, probably that telly that you've already got would probably be good enough to do the job. Likewise, at the start of this video, which you may or may not have noticed, probably I'm going to assume you didn't, I was switching actually in the middle of that solo between a Fender Deluxe Reverb and an Axe Effects multiple times. And I don't know if any of you noticed that happening, but that's the point really, that you get lost in this like amp versus digital debate where really I think actually people will tell less than you can imagine. Like, if you're getting within the right sort of archetype, then these things are fine. I was also reading an interview with the guitarist Mike from Spirit Box, who was talking about just using Neural DSP plugins for some of their stuff, and now those are albums that are being heard by a lot of people. Like, all of the gear that you see people doing demos of and playing with at all levels is going to end up being used by people on this stuff. Like, I think on the early Sleep Token or Loathe albums, George Lever has talked about using Line 6 Pod Farm. Neural DSP plugins are popping up on stuff all the time. It's just the case that basically you can make music with all of what's around you, and I think that's an important thing to remember. And that Bruce Springsteen thing was kind of a bit of another little moment for me, where it's just like, yeah, that is just a reminder that you can do stuff with whatever you've got already, assuming that you have like some of the basics, like an audio interface, a microphone, maybe 2 SM57s. I've only got the one, but maybe 2 would be useful. A couple of instruments, and can you create something from that? I don't know. Let's just pick up a guitar. And I'm going to put this through a compressor and maybe like a bit of a reverb. Can you get something which you've not heard before out of... Right, let's move it further over here. And that's the other thing with Nebraska, like, it's not perfect. If you listen to it, it is noisy. Like, the playing is not perfect, the singing is not perfect. But that's kind of what's beautiful about it. Can you get something to happen from like humble pieces of gear? I think that's quite an attractive idea, especially for me. I've gone down rabbit holes with using boutique stuff and lots of bits and pieces. And not to say that any of it doesn't have value. I think that is an important thing. There is a difference between a handmade £4,000 guitar and a Squier debut. But when you actually condense things down and put them in a context of a wider space, some of those things matter less than maybe we think. Can you make a cheap guitar sound great? Absolutely. Does the gear matter? Actually, yes, to some extent. You know, if you want a really pristine, clear recording, if you want a guitar that sounds absolutely in tune at all points, you know, these things do matter. But actually, also, there's certainly lots of value in like this more lo-fi approach as well, as Bruce Springsteen's Nebraska can show us. I don't know. So the gear does matter. So when people that have all of the gear tell you it doesn't, it's a little bit frustrating. But at the same time, I think you can do great things with humble gear is really the point that you should keep in mind.